Before you can choose a research design or write strong questions, you need to understand what has already been studied and what remains unresolved. That's where the literature gap comes in. For many novice researchers, the idea of identifying a gap in the literature can feel vague or intimidating. It may sound like you need to find something no one has ever written about before, but that's not quite right. A gap isn't just an absence. It's a space where something important is happening, but where scholarly explanations haven't kept up. It might be a phenomenon that's been measured but not understood. It might be a strategy that's been implemented, but hasn't achieved its intended outcomes. It might be a system that's changing faster than the research can explain. The easiest place to begin is by reading the most recent and relevant studies on your topic. Using the research log to document the research questions, methodology, findings, strengths, limitations, and any additional notes. Then as you work through the research logs, compare them to see what they have in common and what they do differently. Ask yourself, what kinds of questions are these studies asking? What methods are they using? What findings are consistent? As you start noticing these patterns, it can be helpful to think about different types of gaps that show up in literature. A population gap exists when certain groups or perspectives are underrepresented, perhaps adult learners, multilingual students, or those in alternative education settings. A design gap appears when researchers consistently use one kind of method, often quantitative surveys, without exploring qualitative experiences or mixed methods insights. A conceptual gap arises when we know a pattern exists, but don't yet understand the mechanism behind it, like how or why something is happening. And a contextual gap can emerge when older studies no longer reflect new policies, technologies, or social conditions. You don't need to name the type of gap in your final paragraph, but recognizing what kind of absence or misalignment you're seeing can help you build a more precise, focused research problem. Pay special attention to limitations and recommendations sections, where authors often describe what their studies couldn't do, or what future research is still needed. As you do this, you may begin to notice a few patterns. For example, maybe most of the studies you find use surveys or statistical models, but none explore the lived experiences behind those numbers. That's a design gap. Maybe most of the studies focus on one population, like traditional college students, but say little about adult learners or multilingual students. That's a population gap. Maybe the studies show that something is happening, like increased use of AI writing tools in classrooms, but don't yet explain how that's affecting students' writing processes. That's a conceptual gap. Or maybe you find studies from before the pandemic that no longer reflect current policies or practices. That's a contextual gap. You don't have to name the gap using technical vocabulary. Rather than saying there is a gap in the literature, your writing shows how to present a real phenomenon, and then surface the place where explanation breaks down. For example, you might write, although school systems have implemented wellness and retention initiatives, educator attrition remains high. That sentence identifies the tension without ever using the word gap. It shows that something is happening that the existing strategies and research haven't fully resolved. Before that, it can also be helpful to sketch out your understanding of the gap before you attempt to write it. Try jotting down 2 or 3 sentences that answer these questions. What is happening? What's unresolved? Why does this matter beyond my immediate context? This informal reflection can help clarify your logic and guide the shape of your paragraph. Another key distinction to keep in mind is the difference between a lack of studies and a lack of explanation. Just because something hasn't been studied in your specific setting doesn't mean there's a meaningful research gap. Also, just because nothing comes up in your search related to your specific study, it doesn't mean that you can't complete your study, since your study is what will fill that gap. A stronger justification arises when the literature can't yet explain how or why a phenomenon is occurring, or when existing patterns no longer hold in light of changing conditions. This distinction helps you move from curiosity to contribution. Once you've located that kind of tension, you're ready to build it into a more refined research problem. That involves 3 layers. First, anchor your study in a real phenomenon, something visible, measurable, or documented in existing systems or policies. Second, name the unresolved tension, a contradiction, inconsistency, or unknown that sits within that phenomenon. Third, articulate the consequence. What happens if we don't resolve this tension, and why it matters for practice, policy, equity, or outcomes. This is the structure your writing models again and again. It's not about filling a blank. It's about entering a scholarly conversation with clarity and purpose. The Aligned Dissertation Workbook also demonstrates multiple sentence patterns that help articulate this kind of gap, without ever saying the word gap. For example, while many districts have implemented practice, outcome remains unexamined, or although existing studies focus on trend, little is known about how concept functions in practice, or despite increasing investment in initiative, issue continues to be inconsistent or underexplored. These patterns can help you transition from observed problems into clearly framed tensions. Including one or two such moves in your draft can signal your place in the scholarly conversation, even before your method is finalized. You also model a consistent technique across your papers and guidance. The transformation of a vague or limited claim into a layered, researchable issue. For instance, you might begin with a sentence like, "Teachers are burned out after the pandemic," and gradually refine it into a fuller claim like, "Districts have implemented wellness programs in response to rising teacher burnout, yet attrition rates remain high, particularly in under-resourced schools." This persistent misalignment suggests a disconnect between systemic response and teacher needs, with consequences for staffing stability and instructional continuity. In published work, you often show that what creates a literature gap is not always absence, it's usually change. A new practice may have emerged, like AI writing tools, or a shift in conditions such as pandemic-era burnout or policy disruption, may have rendered previous studies incomplete or outdated. When the research hasn't caught up with those shifts, that's a contextual gap. Recognizing where the real world has moved beyond the existing literature is a powerful lens for identifying timely and relevant gaps. Another important lesson from your writing is that gaps don't exist in isolation. They live within recognizable problem spaces. These might include areas like college persistence, instructional design, or professional learning. Naming this broader space helps frame your study within an established field of inquiry. And finally, your work often names who benefits if the tension is resolved. That might be students, teachers, administrators, or policy leaders. When you add a sentence like, "Clarifying this tension can support district leaders as they rethink resource allocation," your reader immediately understands why the study matters and who it is meant to help. For example, a weaker version of a gap might say, "Few studies have examined student motivation in online courses." But a stronger version might read, "Although institutions continue to invest in online course design, student engagement and persistence remain low, particularly in asynchronous formats. While previous studies have focused on structural and behavioral metrics, few have examined how students themselves interpret and navigate course design features that affect their motivation." Without that understanding, institutions may continue to invest in interventions that fail to address the root causes of disengagement. It also signals the type of study that could address the issue, likely a qualitative or mixed methods design focused on student perspective. That kind of framing doesn't just justify the study, it hints at its methodological alignment and scholarly contribution. In more advanced writing, you push even further. You show how gaps appear not just in what has been left out, but in what the literature can't yet explain. This requires synthesis. You look across multiple sources and ask, where do outcomes defy expectations? Where do programs or policies not deliver their intended impact? Where do systems continue to struggle despite intervention? These moments of contradiction, complexity, or ambiguity are often where the strongest studies emerge. They allow you to investigate not just what is happening, but why, and what that means for broader structures. A well-framed gap is also grounded in evidence. That means using citations not just to summarize prior work, but to show the lack of evidence around your topic. Finally, The way you describe the gap should align with the kind of knowledge your study will generate. If your tension is about unexplained outcomes, your study may be quantitative. If it's about meaning, interpretation, or experience, your study may be qualitative. If it's about both, a pattern and the experience that explains it, you may need a mixed methods approach. Even though you don't name your design in the problem paragraph, you should write in a way that aligns with the logic of your method. When you show the gap without directly stating it, your writing is stronger, your study is more focused, and your contribution to the field is clearer.